My name is Peg Hacskaylo, and I'm the Executive Director of DASH, the District Alliance for Safe Housing. Our mission at DASH is to be an innovator to ensuring access to safe housing and resources for victims of domestic and sexual violence so that women can rebuild their lives on their own terms. That's our motto. And that's our slogan. We have a pretty basic saying at DASH, which is that home means safety. And what that means to us is that everyone deserves to have a safe place to call home, wherever that may be. And that if it's not safe, it's not home. And DASH is really the peak of the work that I've been doing over my career for the last 20 years. And also it's an example of what the battered women's shelter movement has been aiming for over the last 40 years, which is to create safe places for women to run to so that they can escape violence and put their lives back together. And I'd like to think that DASH is a part of that movement. But beyond providing a safe place for women to run, what we have really aimed to do in the battered women's shelter movement is to create communities of conscience for women, places where women could come together to overcome institutionalized power and control over them, both in the relationships that they've just escaped, but also in the institutions that they interact with on a daily basis. We hoped that through our programs, they would be able to coalesce to provide mutual support and help each other heal and be empowered. And so as we developed programs, we developed our programs to incorporate elements that we thought would help create this ideal. So we would have elements such as, we asked everyone in our shelter to make dinner for everyone else, to take turns making dinner for everyone else in the shelter, so that once a day everyone would sit together and share a meal together. We asked all of the women in the shelter to do chores in the shelter so that they could help keep the shelter clean. And more than that, we thought that it was an opportunity for women to give back and help take responsibility for the upkeep of the shelter. We had mandatory support groups where we worked to raise women's awareness about domestic violence and to try to create supportive communities. And over time, we began sort of limiting access to women that had issues that we really kind of felt like we didn't have the capacity to help deal with. So women who had substance abuse issues or mental illness or maybe criminal histories or disabilities were no longer really able to access our shelters. And over time, we also developed rules that we felt were really necessary to mitigate the circumstances of a lot of families in crisis living together in tight quarters under one roof. And so we would have rules like curfews and parenting requirements and lights out requirements and codes of conduct, and I could go on for hours about those rules. But basically, we thought that these things were necessary, and we told ourselves that they were necessary to ensure the safety of the women living in this shelter and the safety of everyone at that shelter, as well as to promote secure communities and to help encourage healthy lifestyles. And so what we ultimately began to find was that these conditions were creating adverse, not uplifting consequences. So I'll give you a few examples. We had a woman living in our shelter once who had come to us with her 2 preteen daughters after leaving her abusive husband. And her youngest daughter was her father's favorite, and she was so angry at her mother for making her come to the shelter. And so one day she called her father and she told him where she was and asked him to come pick her up. And when he showed up at the shelter, the whole family had to be evicted because she had compromised the safety of everyone in the program. And so the family went back to live with the abuser, and the woman was told that she could never come back to our shelter again. So we had effectively cut her off from any kind of place to run that was safe. We had another example of a nurse who had called our program once She was looking for shelter for a woman who was in the hospital as a result of an assault by her boyfriend, and the woman was blind. And when our intake worker was talking to the nurse, she said, "I'm sorry, we don't accept blind women." And when I asked her later why she said that, she said to me, "Well, how is she going to do her chores?" And then we had another case where we had a woman who was admitted into our program, and while we were doing her intake, she told us that she had a job whose shift required that she was going to have to miss our mandatory support groups. And she was informed that if she couldn't get her schedule changed, that she would need to quit her job in order to keep her place in the shelter. So, I don't know exactly what happened over the years that we were providing this work. As I said, we started out with this ideal. And I don't know if it was that the nature of domestic violence changed, the nature of the women who were accessing shelter changed. Maybe programs had just become more professionalized because of funding restrictions. Or maybe it was just that we were becoming burnt out because we had to listen day in and day out to stories of abuse and violence. And we were so determined never to let that happen to these women again. And moreover, not to let that happen to us either. But we began engaging in constant power struggles with the women in our programs. And these were women that we were ostensibly there to help. And it began to dawn on me that we had become inflexible, disempowering, and controlling of these women in the name of protecting them and ourselves and accomplishing our ideal. Now, I don't want to say that everything was all bad, and granted, we could justify having some of these requirements in place. I mean, the demand for shelter was only increasing all the time, and I have never known a shelter that didn't have a wait list of at least 12 families, if not many more. And so we were under pressure to quickly turn families over in order to meet that constant need. But somewhere along the line, it seemed to me that our vision of a model community of women had become muddy. And what we were attempting to do, what we were expecting women to do, to recover from abuse, to self-actualize, and leave our programs personally improved, all in the space of 90 days, because, of course, that was the maximum length of time our shelter allowed, wasn't just unrealistic. It made no sense. And I began to have a frightening thought, which was that we had taken up where the abusers had left off. So when we started DASH, we wanted to do things differently. And we started with a fairly straightforward set of ideas. That women who are victims of domestic and sexual violence are not all the same, and that they deserve to be treated as individuals and not cases. That they have the right to safety and self-determination on their own terms. That women can be safe without having to be cut off from their support networks. And they deserve the freedom that they didn't have when they were living with their abusers. And most of all, that they are adults who can manage themselves as such, whether they're model citizens or no. Because honestly, who among us doesn't behave badly sometimes, and yet we don't lose our housing as a result of it? So these are simple ideas, but they're complicated to implement. And so what we did is we created a framework of principles which guide our decision-making at DASH. And these are principles like sovereignty, integrity, empowerment, compassion, standards, and partnerships. And these principles surround the core notion of centering. And this is the idea that with balance and wherewithal to get what we need, we can move forward with our lives in a way that is meaningful to us. And really, at its heart, that's what power is. The ability to get what we need and do what we want. And so we use this framework to guide everything that we do at DASH, in our program structure, in our policies and procedures, in our purpose, in our overall purpose. This is a process that is at foremost a flexible one, because finding balance is a constant struggle. And we're always centering and recentering with ourselves, with our participants, with our board members, with our community. It is an ongoing process that never ends. So when we're faced with conflicts or challenges, what we do is we look at this framework and we ask, where are we out of balance? And consider what it is that we need to address in order to restore balance. And sometimes that's just enough, if we can tweak it just enough, to continue being able to move forward in a way that's meaningful for us. Now, this model has become so integral to our work that it's honestly sort of taken on a life of its own. And so now, even now, when I'm facing some kind of a struggle, my staff will look at me and point to the framework and say, what does the model say? And it helps. I have to admit, I actually use it, and it helps a lot. And I'll give you a few examples of how we've used it to guide decisions in our program. I was having a disagreement recently with another community service provider who I felt was duplicating services. And I was really concerned about having to compete with this program for what precious few funding dollars there are for programs like ours out there. And I didn't know how to resolve this conflict. But I looked at the model, and I sort of decided, what is it that I haven't given enough energy to? And I realized that I hadn't been thinking about how a partnership with that program might actually be able to allow us to more effectively serve victims, strengthen our position with funders, and move forward in a way that DASH wants to move forward. So I talked to the program provider about developing a collaborative agreement so that we could delineate our services and more effectively serve our client population. We had another situation where we had a staff person who had begun frequently coming in late for her shift because she had had a recent health diagnosis. And her coworkers were getting frustrated with this because they were relying on her to relieve them of their shifts. So when we sat down with the staff person to recenter, we encouraged her to talk with us, to empower herself, to tell us what her fears were around that diagnosis, what her understanding of the situation was, and what she wanted out of the situation. And we also let her know how her behavior was impacting the partnerships with her colleagues. And ultimately, what we were able to do was to come up with a solution where we could have more flexible shift schedules and create a break room on site so that all of the staff had the ability to take time off during their day and get a break from the stress of the ongoing work. And that was something that helped everybody. One final example, we had a resident who had been coming into the shelter frequently, so high that she couldn't find her apartment unit and needed help getting back into her apartment. And we were concerned about how this was impacting her. So when we sat down to talk with her about it, we had compassion for her. We let her know that we had compassion for her and the pain that she was dealing with, that she was self-medicating with her drug use. But we also let her know how her behavior was impacting her ability to have integrity around accomplishing the goals that she had set out for herself and that she had said that she wanted to accomplish. And when we had several meetings with her like this, she eventually decided to go into a detox program. And we agreed to keep her unit open for her until she came back. So this framework is a process. And it's a messy process. And it's messy because, as people, we're messy. The principles, I like to believe, reflect elements of ourselves: body, mind, spirit, heart, soul, self, and community. And so that, again, when we as people have balance in our lives, among those elements, we have the safety we need to move forward in a way that's meaningful to us. In other words, we have access to our power. This is not a linear process, and it obviously takes longer than 90 days. But as a program, what we have found is that using this framework provides safety on many different levels: physical, emotional, psychological, economic. We're looking at all different ways to ensure safety for everyone. It ensures access and support to everyone who's connected to our program: participants, staff, board members, community members alike. And finally, it creates a community in the way that we know community to be. That's a collective place that has a shared sense of safety and connectedness, where there's good and bad, and we're all just trying to move forward with our lives in a way that's purposeful to us. And sometimes we find that what's purposeful to us is purposeful to others, and we can share that purpose and provide help and support to each other, which only amplifies our safety and our power, because now we're working together. So we accomplish this without pages and pages of rules, and without mandating services, and without limiting access to women who are chemically dependent or who have mental illness or other disabilities, and while allowing women to determine for themselves what they want to accomplish. Instead, what we do, we develop relationships, and we constantly and creatively reach out to the women and offer our help and resources. We provide positive incentives to invite their participation in the programs that we have to offer. And additionally, all of our participants are tenants of right. So they all have apartments with leases in their own names, and we're subject to the same landlord-tenant laws that any other housing provider would have to honor. So our program really does offer safe homes to women where they can live their lives and work towards what they want for themselves. Now, I've been told that this is a radical idea, and I've been accused of putting women at risk. I've been told that our program is irresponsible. I've been told that it would be bedlam and that it just doesn't work. And I'm here to say it works. What we have found over the years is that women express greater degrees of satisfaction, personal safety, and self-efficacy than they do in traditional programs. And they also have higher rates of long-term stability after leaving our housing. So when I say that home means safety, I could just as easily say that safety means home. When women have safety and therefore the means to access our power, what we naturally do is create a home wherever we are, for ourselves and for those we care about. And a vision of women's empowerment and community is possible when it happens naturally on each woman's own terms. And the space between women and power is a safe space that makes home possible for everyone. Thank you.